Hello everyone. I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story number 1. We had gone camping up in the mountains, just a small group of family and friends, and I was sharing a tent with my older brother Luke and our close friend Evan. The night had crept in quietly, and although most had retreated to their tents, we weren't quite ready to sleep. The fire had burned low, casting soft shadows against the trees, and the quiet hum of the wilderness was beginning to settle around us. We slipped inside our tent, unzipped our sleeping bags, and decided to watch a few episodes of Adventure Time on my laptop. It was comforting, the way laughter filtered through the dark, and eventually, our eyelids grew heavy. One by one, we drifted off until I alone found myself startled awake, trapped in an episode of sleep paralysis. I've always had strange sleep habits, and sleep paralysis is something I experience every few months, so it didn't scare me too much initially. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, but my eyes were open, my mind aware, and that was always the most unnerving part. As the paralysis held me in place, the low sounds of the night began to change. I could hear something faint at first, shuffling outside the tent, rhythmic and measured, like the steady pacing of something that was not human. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a deer or the wind against the trees, but it grew louder, clearer, and closer, until I was certain something was not only circling the tent, but actually brushing against it. My laptop still cast a dim bluish glow across the tent walls, offering just enough light to see shadows ripple and move, and that's when I saw it. The fabric began to press inward, slowly, steadily, pushed by something unseen. It was about 4 feet off the ground, moving deliberately around the tent. The imprints were chillingly distinct, long, narrow, and in a set of 3, claws. Not fingers, not paws, claws, and they were real, moving just inches from my face. My heart was thudding, my breath trapped inside my chest as if it too were held hostage by the paralysis. I wanted to scream, to bolt upright, to shake Luke and Evan awake, and tell them that something was outside, but all I could do was watch as it stalked slowly around the perimeter, pushing here, then there, as if testing the boundary between us and it. Despite the terror coursing through me, another part of my brain, the part that had endured this kind of paralysis before, whispered that I was only dreaming, that it wasn't real, that it was all in my mind. And so I just lay there, trapped in stillness, trying to convince myself that it would pass, that nothing could actually be this close, this curious, this quiet, without someone else waking up. But no one stirred, and the imprints kept moving, slow, confident, patient. And then, finally, I felt the shift. The heaviness in my limbs began to lift, and the tightness in my chest loosened. I could move again. I sat up and immediately reached across to Luke, shaking him urgently. My voice was raspy, whispering in fear, trying to tell him to look, to listen, to wake up and see if it was still there. But Luke only grumbled, rolled over, and waved me off with a kind of dismissive tiredness that said he thought I was sleep-talking again. And maybe I was. Maybe it had already left. The shuffling outside had stopped by then, and the silence that followed felt even heavier than the sounds that came before. My eyes darted around, watching, waiting, but nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell back asleep in the lull of the forest's hush. In the morning, it had all but faded from memory. The tent was still, the laptop closed, the sunlight piercing through the tree canopy above in a golden net. We made breakfast, joked around, and went about our day like nothing had happened. But then, as we were cleaning up, my brother-in-law Dean mentioned something that made my stomach turn cold. "Good thing we put the dog in the car last night," he said casually. "There was a bear out here while we were sleeping. A bear." My breath hitched, and my memory flared to life. I turned to him, my mouth already forming questions, and he pointed toward the tree where we'd hung our trash the night before. And there, raked deep into the bark, about 9 feet up, were the fresh claw marks, raw, angry grooves sliced into the wood. It hit me like a shock wave. The claw marks, the noise, the slow, methodical movements around the tent. The claw impressions I'd watched press into the fabric from just inches away. That wasn't a dream. That wasn't sleep paralysis. That was real. I had watched a bear, the real, terrifying kind, press its paw against the thin layer of nylon separating it from me, and I hadn't screamed. I hadn't even run. I had just watched it with silent, frozen eyes. My body had been paralyzed, but my mind had been clear. The bear had sniffed and tested the tent, curious, cautious, and then, satisfied or disinterested, had moved on into the forest night. The thought haunted me more than anything. How close I had been to something that powerful, that dangerous, how I had stared into the movement of its presence, and somehow convinced myself it wasn't real. Sleep paralysis had tricked me into thinking I was safe, and maybe in some twisted way, that saved me. Maybe if I had moved, screamed, or startled it, things would have gone very differently. But I didn't. I watched, and it left. Sometimes I wonder if there's a strange mercy in being frozen, if fear itself knew what was best for me in that moment. I still camp to this day, but that night is etched into me like the claw marks in that tree. Even now, when I lie down in a tent under the open sky, there's always that pause, that breath, that lingering memory of what it means to be so close to the wild and not even know it until it's already gone. People think the scariest part of camping is the unknown, but the truth is, the real terror is in what you do know and what you've already seen. There's something humbling in knowing that you've been within a breath's distance of something so much more powerful than you and lived to tell the story, silently, breathlessly, through the thin walls of a tent, and it waits there in memory, every time the fire dims and the woods go still. Story number 2. When I was 16, I joined a summer program that offered a few weeks out in the wilderness, a kind of retreat into the natural world, with a group of 12 other guys and 4 adult supervisors. It was meant to be a bonding experience. We were supposed to learn to rely on each other, enjoy the quiet simplicity of nature, and find clarity far away from the noise of the city. We had everything you'd expect: roaring campfires, warm cocoa after long hikes, marshmallows to toast under star-dappled skies. The first few nights were calm and typical, filled with laughter and stories whispered through the mesh of our tents. But everything changed one night after the embers had burned low and the stars above blinked quietly in the dark. We had a rule that by 11 p.m., everyone had to be in their tents. That particular night I was in a tent with 2 other guys. None of us were tired, so we whispered to one another, talking about girls, video games, and the random things that teenage boys think are deep. We were tucked into our sleeping bags, staring up at the top of the tent when we first heard the sound. It was subtle at first, like someone breathing heavily a few feet away. We paused our conversation, the kind of pause that comes not from fear, but from mild curiosity. Maybe one of the guys in a nearby tent was snoring loudly or having a dream. But it didn't stop. The breathing had a strange cadence, labored and uneven, like someone who had just run a great distance and was trying to catch their breath without completely collapsing. We kept listening, growing more alert with every drawn-out breath we heard. Then it came, a voice, a low, raspy voice whispering, "Please help." The words floated into our tent like a breeze turned sour. It wasn't a voice we recognized. It didn't belong to anyone in our group, and it sounded older, much older, desperate, weak, terrified. All 3 of us went still, frozen in that dark canvas bubble. None of us wanted to be the first to speak. When it came again, "Please, help me," there was something broken about the voice, something that dug under your skin and stayed there. It wasn't just a call for help. It was a plea from something that shouldn't have been there. The guy closest to the entrance unzipped the inner flap and shined a small flashlight through the mesh. The outer flap remained zipped, but in the spill of faint light, we could see the shape just beyond it. A pair of legs, thin, pale, and naked. The skin looked raw, almost greyish under the moonlight. They weren't the legs of a hiker or someone lost. These legs looked like they belonged to someone who had been wandering the forest for days or weeks, forgotten by time. He spoke again, still wheezing, "Help me. The Rangers. They keep me here." That's when everything inside us changed. Before that, we were unsure. Now we were afraid. He wasn't just lost. He sounded trapped, like a prisoner, or worse, someone who'd lost his mind completely. We didn't know what to do. Should we get the chaperones? Should we talk to him? Should we just stay silent? My friend near the entrance stammered out, "Keep walking down the trail. The ranger station is just ahead." It wasn't true, but it was all he could think to say. The man didn't answer. He stood still for a moment, and then he began to sob. But it wasn't just any sobbing. It was raw and eerie, like something broken was crying from somewhere deep inside him. Then he turned and ran, vanishing into the woods with surprising speed. We didn't chase him. We didn't move. We couldn't. The forest swallowed him, and we were left alone with the sound of our own racing hearts. Within moments, we were scrambling to unzip the tent and find one of the adults. When we finally reached one of the chaperones and explained what had happened, he grabbed a flashlight and came with us to where the man had stood. We scanned the area, calling out softly, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no belongings. Just a faint, lingering feeling in the air, like something had passed through and left a silence behind it. Eventually, the chaperone shrugged it off, saying it was probably a hiker in distress, but we knew better. We knew what we saw, what we heard. That was not just a hiker. That was someone or something that didn't belong. The next day, we brought it up again. Some of the other guys admitted hearing something in the night, but no one else saw what we saw. No one else heard that voice, those strange words, the broken plea for help. For the rest of the trip, we slept lighter. We stayed closer to camp, and when night came, we stayed inside our tents, zipped up and silent. The adults didn't mention it again, and after a while, we stopped talking about it too. But the image stayed with us. Those legs, that voice, and the way he vanished into the trees like he'd never existed at all. Years later, I sometimes wonder what we really saw. Was it someone who had escaped from somewhere? Someone lost? Or was it something darker, something tied to the forest in a way we can't understand? What if the rangers he mentioned weren't people at all? What if he was warning us about something we never saw? That night felt like we had been caught in a story far older than we were. Like we'd stumbled into a part of the forest where time twisted, where people disappeared and returned as shadows. I still don't know what haunts me more, the man we saw, or the possibility that he was right, that he wasn't just lost, but trapped. I've camped since then, sure. I've even gone back to that forest once, just to see if I could find the trail again, but the air felt different, heavier, older. I didn't stay long. I've come to believe that some things in nature don't want to be explained. They live in the folds of quiet woods, behind the trees, beneath the leaves. They appear when you least expect them, speaking in broken voices, wearing sorrow like skin. And they wait, always wait, for someone to hear them whisper, "Please help," hoping someone will listen, and praying no one ever truly answers. Story number 3. It was the beginning of my recovery, both physically and spiritually. I had spent the better part of the year entangled in the claws of heroin, drifting further from myself with every high. But after months of effort, the love of family, and the sheer force of survival, I was finally finding my way out. To clear my head, I made a decision that felt almost instinctive. I packed up and drove out of the city. I didn't have a plan, just a destination suggested by Google Maps, a quiet little campsite beside a river in the middle of Missouri. It was the kind of place where the air felt different, where you could breathe without effort and hear your own thoughts again. The drive was long and winding, the sky overcast with that gentle grey that makes the world feel quieter than usual. As I neared the turnoff, mist blanketed the trees, and a lonely dog appeared in the road ahead, lying still as if waiting for me. I slowed the car, rolled down my window, and saw her trot up to me, tail wagging like she had been expecting me all along. Her fur was a mess, no tag or collar, but her eyes were kind. She licked my hand through the window, and I felt something shift. She wasn't just a stray, she was with me somehow. Naturally, I opened the passenger door, and she hopped in without hesitation. Just like that, I had a companion. The entrance to the campsite was only half a mile further, and as expected, there was no one else around. I dropped a 5 in the honor box and picked the closest site to the river. The stillness wrapped around me like a blanket. I set up my old, familiar tent, the same one my dad had taught me to pitch when I was a kid. Then I started a small fire, tossing in dry sticks while the dog with no name padded around the site, sniffing leaves and wagging her tail. After a while, I wandered down to the river. It was about 30 feet wide with a man-made stone dam. The water flowed lazily to one side, deeper and darker in one direction, gently cascading into calmer shallows on the other. Something about it called to me, not just to be looked at, but to be entered. Maybe it was the Catholic in me. Maybe it was the symbolism of a cleansing, a quiet baptism, a washing away of all that I had been. The dog watched me from the edge of the campsite as I stood there contemplating the idea, but the water was cold. My towel was back in the car. I hesitated. I turned away, disappointed in myself. I climbed back up the trail and sat near the fire, smoking a cigarette, petting the dog, roasting a hot dog over the low flames. The dog curled up beside me when I finally crawled into the tent. She slept beside my bag, still and warm, and for the first time in a long time I felt safe. Sometime in the deep hours of the night I woke up. There was no noise that pulled me out of sleep, just a feeling, an alertness. I reached instinctively toward the space where the dog had been, but she was gone. The zipper of the tent had been nudged open just slightly, and I crawled out, expecting to find her sniffing around the fire pit. Instead, she was sitting perfectly still a few feet away, facing the river, tail wagging gently. The world around me was black and silent, the stars hanging still above. I felt pulled toward the river again, like I had unfinished business. The dog stood when I approached and trotted ahead, leading me down the narrow path to the water's edge. The stones of the dam were cold beneath my feet, and a chill ran up my spine. The dog sat again, watching me from the bank as I began to undress. Standing naked on those slick, mossy rocks, I felt both brave and afraid. The water was darker than I remembered, inky, impenetrable, like something ancient and endless lay beneath it. I hate swimming in water when I can't see the bottom. My imagination fills in the gaps with monsters, hands, shadows waiting to pull me under. But something in me said to do it. Not for bravery, not for the ritual, but because I had to. So I did. I dove into that cold blackness with a gasp and a shiver, the shock of it stealing my breath and clearing my head all at once. I thrashed, kicked back toward the stones, and climbed out, dripping and panting, more awake than I'd been in years. My skin prickled in the air, but I wasn't cold. I felt clean, reborn, lighter. I shook off the water and reached for my shoes, smiling to myself. That's when I looked for her, the dog with no name. But she was gone. I called softly into the woods, then louder, but she didn't come. I walked back to the campsite, half expecting her to be waiting for me by the fire pit, but the site was empty. I circled it, whistling, calling again, but the forest didn't answer. I sat by the fire, lit a cigarette, and waited as the sky began to hint at dawn. She never returned. I packed my things slowly, quietly. The dog with no name had found me on that road, brought me to this river, and vanished just as silently as she'd come. The trip was over. It had lasted only a day, but it felt like something far more complete, like I'd gone out to face something inside me, and had walked away changed. When I reached my car, I turned on my phone. The clock was off by exactly 1 hour. At first I panicked, thinking I'd slept too long or not enough. But then I realized it was daylight savings time. Still, the timing felt too perfect, too eerie. The change had occurred while I was in the river, while I was under, like I had stepped through something, come out slightly shifted. It sounds crazy, but that moment, that river, the missing dog, it all felt like a thread pulled loose in the fabric of reality. I don't talk about it often. Most people wouldn't understand. They'd laugh, chalk it up to a weird night and a stray dog. But I knew. I know. The dog never came back. And I never used heroin again. I don't pretend to understand what really happened out there in those quiet woods, but something led me to that spot. Something watched over me, waited with me, and left when its job was done. Whether it was fate, luck, a guardian of sorts, or just a dog with impeccable timing, I will never know. What I do know is that I walked into those woods carrying something I needed to let go of, and I walked out, wet, shaken, and strangely reborn, with the ghost of a dog and the sound of the river forever etched into my memory. Even now, whenever I find myself facing something I can't quite handle, I remember that black pool, the slick stones beneath my feet, and the wag of a tail under moonlight. Sometimes healing doesn't come in hospitals or meetings or long conversations. Sometimes it comes from a river, a night sky, and a pair of silent, kind eyes that find you on a road in the middle of nowhere. Story number 4. There's something about old mining regions that already feels touched by ghosts, like the land holds its breath, remembering what once happened there. I was prospecting in the Caribou region, far from any towns or familiar trails, surrounded by trees that seemed to whisper in a language only the past could understand. I'd been working a secluded site where a series of rock piles, known as Chinese piles, rose up like the ruins of forgotten labor. These piles were unmistakable markers of hard manual work from Chinese miners during the gold rush days. Finding them meant someone had dug there before, and where they had dug, gold often followed. I felt lucky to have stumbled upon such a site. I spent an hour and a half working steadily and managed to collect about 10 grams of gold. It was enough to put a smile on my face and a rhythm in my step. But that joy didn't last long. As I walked between the piles, brushing dust from my hands, I noticed something peculiar. Small standing stones perched atop some of the larger rock walls. At first I thought nothing of it, maybe just decorative markers left by other modern explorers. But then I noticed the Chinese characters etched into them. Clear and deliberate, worn down by time, but still legible. A quiet sense of dread settled into my stomach. I knew enough from history to understand that these were not just markers, they were gravestones. I had stumbled upon an unmarked cemetery, forgotten for over a century. Miners who died out there, alone in the wilderness, were buried where they fell, and their comrades would mark the sites and then move on, refusing to dig further. They believed the ground became cursed, and their friend's spirit would linger angrily if disturbed. Out of respect, and perhaps fear, they'd leave the site untouched from then on. Suddenly the gold in my hand didn't feel like treasure. It felt like theft. I placed it gently inside a glass bottle I found nearby, set it down on one of the graves, and backed away, whispering an apology I hoped would carry to whatever remained. Later, I took sketches of the symbols and brought them to a local historian, hoping I was wrong. But I wasn't. He confirmed it. They were graves. Over 150 years old, and almost certainly undisturbed since the day they were sealed. Some part of me was grateful that I had not taken the gold with me. Another part, deeper and quieter, was afraid that even standing there had been a mistake. I didn't dig there again. Not once. I visited a few more times, always keeping my distance. The piles took on a different look in the morning fog, less like remnants of mining and more like people frozen in time, huddled around a story no one had finished telling. My boss told me a story that only made the region feel darker. Back in the 1970s, some shady men from Prince George came through, looking to steal mining gear from old sites. They were the kind of men who didn't care about curses or graves or history. They were just chasing gold. One of them took a forgotten trail into a clearing and found 2 rusting bulldozers and a small wooden cabin. While the others tried to see if the machinery still worked, he wandered into the cabin, expecting to find nothing more than dust and decay. But what he found was a skeleton, curled up on the bed like it had simply gone to sleep and never woken up. A single bullet hole in the skull told the truth of how he died. I went with my boss to see that cabin years later, but it had since burned to the ground, likely torched by careless AT riders. Still, standing in that clearing where a life had ended in silence, you could feel something linger. It's not just death that haunts these places. It's the forgetting. The way a man can vanish, and a decade, then 2, then 8 will pass before someone even realizes he was missing. His bones sleeping in an empty room while the forest grows loud around him. Maybe that's why I could never bring myself to dig in the Chinese piles again. I couldn't shake the image of those miners, cold, tired, far from home, burying their friends and building stone mounds in silence, then walking away, leaving grief and gold buried together. Some days I'd hike out there just to sit near the site, listen to the wind, and feel the weight of that history press softly on my shoulders. The silence was different in that spot. It wasn't the usual quiet of deep woods. It was a held breath, a respectful hush. I'd bring a thermos of coffee and sit on a rock near the tree line, never setting foot too close, and always I would see them in the fog, the faint outlines of men hunched low, tools in hand, heads bowed. You could tell yourself it was mist and imagination, but the mind knows, the soul knows. I began to notice things when I stayed too long, things that weren't there before, stones shifting positions, scratches in the bark that hadn't been there the day before. One morning, after a thunderstorm, I returned and found a single boot print near the graves. Just one. Deep. Fresh. It hadn't rained in days prior, and I hadn't been there since. I searched the area, called out, thinking maybe someone had passed through, maybe a hunter or another prospector. But no voice answered, and no trail followed the footprint. It was as if someone had stepped out of the earth, stood there a while, then vanished back into the trees. I never brought friends out there. I never told anyone the exact location. Something about it felt private, not mine to share. People often ask me if I've ever struck it rich out there. They think the stories are just campfire tales, decorations for lonely days in the wilderness, and maybe they are. But I never chased gold the way I used to. Something changed after that day with the dog tags and headstones. Something about how I see the land, how I listen to the silence. I've found small catches since, but I never dig, unless I'm sure it's untouched, unburied, unseen. The old miners had their reasons deeper than superstition. They understood something that most of us forget, that the land remembers. And if you listen closely, it might just tell you why you should tread carefully. I often dream about that place, even now. The dreams are never frightening. They're slow, steady, and soft. I'm always walking through the mist, past the stone piles, hearing foreign voices I can't quite translate. Sometimes I see the man in the cabin, lying peacefully, as if he finally found rest. Other times it's the miners still building, still digging, still watching. And sometimes it's just me, sitting with my coffee, listening to a silence filled with the ghosts of old stories, and thanking whatever power watches over that land for letting me leave without taking more than I was meant to. Story number 5. When I was a kid, our home stood nearly 100 miles from the nearest town, nestled deep in the rugged Colorado Rockies. There was no electricity, no running water, just raw nature stretching endlessly in every direction. Our neighbors were few and scattered, mostly other families with seasonal hunting cabins, long since abandoned for the winter. By the time the snow began to fall, we were often the only ones left up there, surrounded by quiet forests and steep trails. Our house hidden behind a gate, nearly a mile and a half off the main access road. The gate wasn't one you could simply drive around. Trees, barbed wire, and deep ditches made any attempt at detouring almost impossible. It was there to keep people out, and keep us in, until we wanted otherwise. On that particular night, my mom, brother, sister, and I were all packed into the truck, ready to head into town, when we realized we couldn't find the key to the gate. It was a cold January night. Snow had fallen the day before, blanketing the world in silence. Clouds drifted across the moon, letting through occasional bursts of starlight that flickered like faint beacons in the dark. No flashlight, no backup key, and only one solution. Someone had to walk back up to the house, through the forest, retrieve the spare key, and return to unlock the gate. That someone, of course, was me. At 15, I was the youngest and the most annoyed, mumbling under my breath about how unfair it was. With every step I took through the snow-laced trees, my frustration grew louder than my fear. At first, it felt like any other walk. I knew this trail. I traveled it hundreds of times, barefoot in the summer, bundled in boots during the winter. First came about 200 meters of thick forest. Then it opened into a long meadow that narrowed again into more trees. Then another clearing. And finally our house nestled beneath the stars. But But halfway through the first meadow, something shifted. It wasn't a sound or a movement, just a feeling sharp and unignorable, like I wasn't alone, like something unseen had noticed me. My breath fogged in front of me as I paused, straining to hear past the snow. The silence was too complete. No wind, no animal rustlings, just that dense, smothering quiet that only comes in the woods at night after a snowfall. Then, faintly behind me, I heard it, an echoing crunch. It mirrored my footsteps exactly, only half a beat delayed. I froze, my heartbeat pounding so loudly it almost covered the noise. I turned my head slowly, eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing. Just snow and shadow. But the feeling didn't leave. It only deepened, curling around my gut and whispering to me that I was being watched. I told myself it was just nerves, just my imagination playing tricks. But I picked up the pace, boots crunching faster along the trail. The trees drew closer as I entered the second patch of forest, and I realized my ears were straining so hard I was starting to hear phantom sounds. Branches that didn't move, breath that wasn't mine. Then the trail opened up again, and I could see the glow of our cabin in the distance. Relief surged through me, but so did something else. Urgency. The predatory instinct kicked in, and I knew I had to run. I don't remember deciding to scream, but I did. Loud and sharp, cutting through the frozen air. That scream woke our dogs, and I heard them barking wildly from the porch. Within seconds, I saw their shapes charging toward me. They ran right past me, ears back, growling low and guttural. Whatever had been behind me, they were going for it. I didn't wait to see what they found. I ran as fast as my legs could take me, through the clearing, up the steps, and into the safety of our home. Once inside, I didn't bother with warmth or comfort. I grabbed the shotgun first, then the spare key, then the tractor keys. There was no way I was walking that trail again. As I rode the tractor back toward the gate, I saw the dogs returning, panting hard, tails low. They hadn't been hurt, but they hadn't been chasing nothing. I saw the tracks, clear, feline prints in the snow, large and deliberate. A mountain lion had followed me, step for step, through the trees. I told my family what had happened. They believed me. Up in the Rockies, everyone respects the mountains and what moves through them. We knew the signs. That cougar had likely been watching me since the first meadow, creeping silently, waiting for a misstep, a stumble, a moment of weakness. I hadn't seen it, but I had felt it. I learned then that sometimes instincts are sharper than sight. That night stayed with me. I didn't sleep well, lying awake and thinking of those prints, of how close the cat had come, the sense of breath on the back of my boots, the echo of its steps behind mine. I imagined it perched somewhere just beyond the trees, eyes glowing, deciding whether or not I was worth the chase. After that, I never walked alone in the woods at night without a weapon. Not once. Even if it was just to fetch something from the barn or check on the fence line. The wilderness taught me something that night: respect. Fear, yes, but more than that. A sense of reverence for the predators that moved silently, for the instincts that rose unbidden, and for the thin, fragile line between being safe and being hunted. It's a line we rarely realize we're standing on until we've already crossed it. Years later, I returned to that trail during the day. The snow had melted, the meadows were green again, but the feeling came back the moment I stepped into the first clearing. Not fear exactly, but a memory. A shadow, as if that night had marked the land and me forever. Sometimes, even now, I'll walk that same path in my mind when I can't sleep. I'll feel the cold, the silence, the echo of footsteps, and I'll remember how it felt to be 15, alone, and almost pray. Not to a ghost or a story, but to something very real, very alive, and very close. Story number 6. It happened when I was a Boy Scout, during one of those long, adventurous treks into the wilderness that scouts love to talk about years later. We had hiked for days through rugged terrain, encountering wildlife, sharing stories, and pushing our limits under the guidance of seasoned adults. The area we were camping in had a reputation, tied closely to the ancient Pueblo people, known as the Anasazi. Their history was rich and mysterious, and the land carried their silence like a weight. Our final destination was a wood cabin at the base of a plateau, where we planned to rest before continuing onward. That evening, a park ranger gathered us around the fire and shared old stories about the Anasazi, about their lost language, their obsessions, and the way ravens played a strange spiritual role in their beliefs. They were said to worship, or perhaps fear, entities with raven heads, large winged beings that watched from above. That story stayed with me more than I expected. Maybe it was because the ranger's voice grew lower as he spoke, or maybe it was the way the night wrapped around us, like a dark curtain, silent except for the occasional crack of firewood. But even after we went to bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the plateau above us, the way the trees reached upward like they were trying to escape something. My tent mate that night was a quiet kid, someone I didn't know very well. He had allergies and was slower than most of us on hikes, but I liked him. That night, he accidentally ate something with peanuts, which he was highly allergic to. Between that scare and the rising tension about bears, we'd seen them every day. The adults decided we'd sleep on top of the plateau instead of continuing the next leg of the trail. It wasn't allowed, but we did it anyway. I remember being uneasy as we set up our gear. The ground was hard, and the wind up there carried a strange rhythm, like it moved in waves instead of gusts. But I lay down anyway, staring at the ceiling of the tent, trying to sleep. That's when the thunder started. Not rain, not lightning, just thunder. Deep, bone-shaking rolls that seemed to come from directly overhead. My tent mate heard it too. We whispered about it, trying to figure out what was going on. It didn't make sense. There was no storm, no clouds, just noise, constant pounding noise. Eventually, curiosity won over fear. My tent mate decided to unzip the flap and check it out. He stepped outside while I stayed in my sleeping bag, craning my neck to see what he saw. Behind him, I glimpsed the tree line, lit strangely by the full moon. He was gone for a few minutes. When he came back, he said nothing, just lay down and closed his eyes. I thought it was weird, but I didn't press. Maybe he didn't see anything. Maybe he didn't want to talk about it. But the next morning, things felt wrong in a way that was hard to explain. First, our tent had changed orientation. We had been facing the forest, but now we were facing a wide open field. Second, no one else in the group had heard the thunder. Not a single person. My tent mate didn't even remember going outside. He was confused when I asked him about it, said the last thing he recalled was laying down and trying to sleep. That alone was unsettling, but it got worse. One of the other scouts, in the tent next to ours, mentioned something without us even bringing it up. He said he had also gotten up in the night and stepped outside to check on the sound, but what he described was not the same forest. He said when he unzipped his tent, he didn't see trees. He saw tall black poles, hundreds of them, stretching high into the sky. No branches, no leaves, just poles like the stilts of an ancient structure. He said everything was too bright, like the moon had become something unnatural, flooding the land with a light too white to be real. Then he looked up and saw them. Large winged shapes, pitch black against the too bright sky. They weren't birds. He was sure of that. He said they were too big, and they weren't flying like birds. They hovered, floated, pulsed through the air like they were scanning the ground. One of them drifted toward him, and he panicked, dove back into his tent, and blacked out. When he woke, the light was gone, and everything was normal. But he said he never truly fell asleep again. We all sat around that morning, drinking water and eating dry oatmeal, looking at each other without saying much. There was a shared tension that none of us wanted to acknowledge out loud. The adults thought we were just groggy from poor sleep, but I knew. I remembered the thunder. I remembered the forest moving. I remembered the strange alignment of the tent, and I remembered my tent mate's blank face when I asked him what he saw. There was a space between memory and truth that none of us could fill. Something had happened. Something we weren't supposed to understand. Something tied to the land, to the stories of raven-headed beings, to the old ghosts of the Anasazi. That night changed the way I looked at the wilderness, not as something to conquer or explore, but as something that might be watching us in return. The plateau we camped on wasn't just high ground. It was a thin place, A place where something bled through, something older, something that had been there long before us and would remain long after we were gone. Even now, when I hike through unfamiliar terrain and hear the distant roll of thunder, with no storm in sight, I freeze. I listen. And I remember that night, that field, that light. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had stepped outside too. If I had stood beneath that unnatural moon, watched the sky crack open with dark wings, would I have remembered more? Or would I have forgotten it all like my tent mate? Would I be one of the kids who laughed at the story now? Or would I still be haunted by the image of something hovering just out of reach? Not hostile, but not welcome either. Some things aren't meant to be explained. Some things just happen, and we carry the weight of them in silence, like ghosts of our own memories. Story number 7. Back in my early 20s, I spent a year working as a private investigator. It sounds glamorous, like something pulled from a crime novel, but the reality was a lot less exciting and a lot more lonely. Most of the job involved long hours in a car, sitting perfectly still with the engine off, trying not to blink too often while you watched a door or a driveway. Then you'd spend another few hours back at a cheap motel writing up reports, eating microwave meals, and scrolling through blurry photos to determine if someone had cheated or lied. I took the job after finishing medical training with the Army Reserves. I was young, hungry for adventure, and convinced that a life on the road would feel freeing. But in truth, it often felt empty, just me, my car, and the road stretching on in both directions. That's how I ended up on a twisting mountain road just outside of Taos, New Mexico, one night around 2 a.m. The woods there are thick, and the road is narrow, coiling tightly around the steep sides of the mountain like a ribbon of black ink. There weren't any houses, no cabins, not even signs. Just trees pressing close, like they were trying to lean in and see who dared pass through so late. My headlights flicked over the asphalt and the thick trunks beyond it. I had my window cracked to let in the cold air, and the hum of tires on pavement was the only sound accompanying me. I was tired, but not dangerously so, still sharp enough to react, still focused on the next curve ahead. And then I saw her. She appeared like a ghost in the headlights, stumbling along the edge of the road. A woman. She was carrying a child in her arms, small and still. Her movements were strange, jerky, slow, like her limbs didn't belong to her. It wasn't just the sight of her that unsettled me. It was the way she moved, like she wasn't entirely real, or like something inside her was broken. Her head stayed down. She didn't look at me, didn't react to the light or the sound of my approach. She just kept walking, one foot dragging a little behind the other. Her shoulders slumped forward, as though gravity had grown too heavy. I passed her slowly, instinctively slowing down, my hands tight on the wheel. The road curved again, and she disappeared behind the trees. I kept driving, but my mind stayed with her. Who was she? What was she doing out there at this hour, in the middle of nowhere, with a child? There were no homes, no parked cars, no lights in the distance, just forest. The rational part of my brain began calculating. Maybe she had been in an accident. Maybe she'd broken down and had been walking for miles. Maybe the child was injured. I couldn't ignore it. I was a trained medic. I had spent months in trauma centers, dealing with people in worse shape than this. I knew I had to help. The longer I drove, the heavier that knowledge became. I couldn't leave her behind. If something happened to that child and I had done nothing, how could I live with that? I found the first safe place to turn around, heart pounding, and started retracing my path. The road felt darker now. My headlights seemed weaker, the trees closer. I drove slowly, scanning every bend, every shoulder, looking for her pale shape in the darkness, but she was gone. Completely. I went back and forth along that stretch of road 6 times. No sign. No footprints. No woman. No child. Just the road and the forest and the awful sense that something had slipped through my fingers. I parked and got out, walking along the shoulder, calling out. My voice echoed strangely in the stillness. Nothing replied. Not even birds. I checked for signs of a vehicle veering off the road, maybe down a ravine, but the ground was undisturbed. After nearly an hour, I stopped. Just stood in the middle of the road, looking at the trees, feeling the kind of fear that doesn't shout. It whispers. It didn't feel like I had missed her. It felt like she had never been there at all, but I know what I saw. I wasn't sleep deprived. I wasn't hallucinating. She was real. That child was real. But the forest had swallowed them whole, without a trace. I kept thinking about her legs, the way they moved as if her body was being carried by something else, the way she didn't look at me, didn't react, like I hadn't really been there either. Eventually, I gave up and returned to my car, hands cold, breath fogging in the air. I sat behind the wheel, engine idling, replaying the moment over and over in my head. Maybe she hadn't needed help. Maybe she hadn't even been alive. That thought didn't sit well with me. I still don't believe in ghosts. Not really. I've watched too many grainy paranormal shows to be convinced by lights and bumps and shadows, but I can't explain that night. I saw something that didn't make sense, and never would. I filed my report late and didn't mention it. What could I even say? Saw a woman vanish into the trees. It's been 10 years since that drive, and I still think about her. I think about the child in her arms. I wonder if someone else saw her that night. If someone else turned around and found nothing, or maybe I was the only one meant to see her. I don't know what she was. A lost soul, a memory, a trick of the dark, but I know she was real. As real as the fear I felt, as real as the silence afterward, and I'll carry that with me forever. If you're out there, if you were stumbling down that road with your child in Taos, New Mexico, a decade ago, I hope you're okay. I hope you made it out. And if you weren't ever really there, if you were something else entirely, then I hope you find peace, whatever form that takes, because I still see you in my dreams, still hear your footsteps echoing in the pine-scented dark, and I still wonder what I could have done if I had just turned around a little sooner. Story number 8. The Appalachian Trail has always drawn people who need time with themselves. Quiet, winding paths that stretch endlessly, letting you forget the chaos of the world behind. For years, I would take solo hikes there, sometimes for a weekend, sometimes for a full week or more. It was peaceful in a way few places are. No buzzing cities, no deadlines. Just the trail, the trees, the sky, and the occasional voice from another traveler heading the opposite direction. One twilight, as the horizon softened, and the first stars began to peek through the canopy above, I crested a pass and saw someone up ahead. She was a lone young woman, walking the same path, heading in the same direction, with a slow and steady pace. I called out to her with a simple hey, a customary greeting among hikers, but she didn't stop, didn't even look back. That struck me as odd. Most people, even if they're shy, at least give a nod or wave, but she kept going. Her posture slouched, her arms swinging low. I couldn't see her face from where I was, but something about her energy felt closed off. I figured she'd had a rough day and didn't want to talk, so I kept my pace steady and left her alone. As she disappeared over the next pass, I noticed something strange. She had no flashlight, no headlamp, not even a flicker of glow from a phone. And this trail, while beautiful, had tricky footing, exposed roots, uneven patches, places where a single misstep could send you tumbling. It was risky to walk it without light, especially as night swallowed the last of the dusk. Worried now, I sped up, hoping to catch up and maybe offer her a spare light, or at least walk beside her. But when I reached the top of the next ridge, she was gone. I could see the trail clearly for about 200 yards, and there was no one ahead, no side paths, no rocks to hide behind, just a trail in the woods and a strange, lingering emptiness. A few minutes later, I saw the glow of 2 headlamps in the distance, coming toward me. I slowed down and called out a greeting again. This time a man and woman responded. We met on the trail and exchanged the usual stories, trail names, where we'd camped, where we were headed next. I told them about the woman ahead. She didn't have a light, I said, frowning. Kind of surprised me. She must run like hell to get this far ahead of me, though. The woman hiker blinked. What are you talking about? She asked. We haven't seen anyone for miles. I explained again, described the woman's pace. her direction, and how I tried to catch up. The couple looked at each other uneasily. "We've been hiking this section for the last 3 hours," the man said slowly. "We didn't pass anyone. And we would have. There's nowhere to hide along here." I felt a chill move through me, not cold from the air, but something else, a sliver of unease threading its way into my thoughts. I didn't say anything more until we parted ways. They headed west. I went east, but my steps were slower now, each one heavy with thought. Who had I seen? Where had she gone? The forest felt tighter somehow, the silence more intentional. I slept lightly that night, my hammock strung between 2 trees, my rain-flea rustling in the breeze. Every crack of a twig sent my ears straining. Every gust of wind felt like breath on my skin. I kept seeing her, alone, walking barefoot through the dark, face hidden, footsteps silent, vanishing into a trail that had nowhere to hide. The next day, I checked in with the ranger station. I asked if anyone had reported a missing person, a solo female hiker, anything out of the ordinary, but they hadn't. No reports, no abandoned campsites, no backpacks found on the side of the trail. It was as if she had never existed at all. But I had seen her. I know what my eyes told me. The way she moved, the way she didn't acknowledge my voice, the way she disappeared without a sound. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't exhaustion. It was something else, something older than reason. Over time, I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was an ultra-light hiker, someone experienced enough to move quickly in low light, someone who didn't need much. But even that doesn't sit right. Her silence, her stillness, her absence when I reached the ridge, it didn't add up. And that feeling in the pit of my stomach, the one that twisted when the couple said they hadn't seen her, that's what I keep coming back to. It felt like I had witnessed a tear in the fabric of the ordinary, a person who didn't belong, a presence that stepped across the trail and left no mark. I still hike that region sometimes, and I still think about her. When the light starts to fade and the air begins to cool, I find myself glancing ahead on the trail, half expecting to see her again, walking slowly, soutly, just out of reach. Part of me hopes I do, and part of me prays I don't. Because if I do, I might not be lucky enough to just watch her disappear. I might follow. I might step where she stepped, and find that some paths don't lead back. Story number 9. Years ago, I took a job as a night security guard for a construction project out in the forest. It was a summer camp being built deep in the woods, far from any nearby towns, surrounded by thick trees and quiet air. The access road was little more than a dirt path cut into the earth, winding miles into the forest before it reached the clearing where the future camp would be. Every night, I drove out there and parked in a tiny wooden booth not much bigger than a phone booth, my station for the shift. I was alone out there. There were no buildings, just frameworks and piles of materials. My duty was simple: make rounds every hour on foot, walk the 2-mile loop through the partially cleared land, and make sure nothing was tampered with. After that, I'd return to my booth, log the time, and wait for the next hour to roll by. At first, the job was uneventful, boring. Really. Occasionally, I'd spot a black bear lumbering in the distance, or a bobcat slinking through the brush, but they never came close. I'd hear coyotes singing in the distance some nights, their calls echoing through the trees like the wind itself was wailing. But it was all background noise, part of the rhythm of being alone in the wilderness. It was peaceful in its own strange way. You begin to learn the patterns of the forest, the way the wind stirs at certain times, how long the quiet holds between rustles in the trees. But one night, everything changed. It was around 3 a.m., near the end of my shift, when I finished a patrol and returned to the booth. I had just passed the main gate, letting my flashlight sweep lazily along the tree line, when I heard it. A scream. High-pitched, piercing and completely unnatural. It echoed from somewhere down the road I had just walked, slicing through the silence with a kind of panic that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the scream of an animal. I knew those. Bobcats, coyotes, they have a specific spine-tingling sound. But this sounded human. A woman, screaming like her life depended on it. The sound was so sudden, so raw, that I didn't even hesitate. I sprinted down the road toward it, heart hammering in my chest. My flashlight bobbed with each stride, the beam bouncing between trees, shadows lurching on either side. But after that initial scream, nothing. No second cry. No rustle. No movement. Just the pounding of my boots on dirt and the sound of my own breathing. A quarter-mile down the road, I saw it, the car. Parked just off the side, halfway hidden by the trees. It hadn't been there earlier. I would have seen it during my rounds. It wasn't running. No lights, no open doors. Just sitting there like it had always been. I called out, stepping cautiously closer. Hello? Anyone there? Nothing. Not even the chirp of insects. I moved around the car slowly, sweeping my light across the interior. Empty. No signs of struggle. No blood. No clothes. The silence was oppressive, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I scanned the woods around the car, but there was no trail, no broken branches or disturbed earth. It was like the scream had come from nowhere. Eventually I backed away and returned to my booth. I radioed it in and called the local police. When they arrived, they walked the road, examined the car, and took my statement. They ran the plates and found out it belonged to a man who lived nearby, but they wouldn't say much else. They towed the car away, and that was that. No follow-up. No news, just silence. I never learned who the man was, or why he left his car there in the middle of the night, or if he had anything to do with the scream I heard. My supervisor later suggested it might have been a mountain lion or an owl echoing in a strange way. But I knew better. I've spent too many nights listening to the voices of the forest. That wasn't an animal. For weeks afterward, I couldn't shake the sound. It would come back to me suddenly, when I was washing dishes or brushing my teeth. A scream, high and desperate, caught in the air like it had nowhere to go. I began to dread the night shift. Every time I walked past the gate, I'd scan the darkness, waiting for another sound, another cry, but it never came. Whatever happened that night, whatever made that sound, it was a one-time thing, a single crack in the normal, a glimpse into something I wasn't supposed to witness. I started leaving my rounds a little shorter after that. I stayed closer to booth. I kept the door closed and locked. My flashlight never left my hand. Some people might say I overreacted, that I let my imagination get the best of me. But imagination doesn't leave tire tracks on a dirt road. Imagination doesn't leave a parked car where none should be. Something happened. Something I still don't understand. Even now, years later, I sometimes dream about that scream. In the dream, I don't stop running. I keep chasing it through the forest deeper and deeper, until the road disappears and the trees lean too close. And always, just before I catch up to the sound, I wake up. My body is stiff. My heart is racing. The scream is still ringing in my ears. And I wonder, what would have happened if I had kept running that night? What would I have found?